My name is Pete Damiano. I direct the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and I would like to welcome this tremendous crowd to our event this evening, China, Iowa, and Diplomacy in the Trump Administration. Obviously very, very timely. I think most of you are aware that Governor Branstad had his confirmation hearing yesterday at the start of the process for being confirmed as ambassador, and we're very excited to have people with expertise both in diplomacy and in relationships with China here tonight. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Public Policy Center, we're part of the university. Our primary job is to do research to inform policymakers and bring people together from a variety of different perspectives on a lot of different issues. This tonight is a part of our community engagement mission to share that information with the public and policymakers, again, from all different perspectives. We're very pleased to be able to co-sponsor tonight's event with the Des Moines Register, and Lynn Hicks, the opinion page editor of the Des Moines Register, is going to be one of the moderators, as well as Iowa Public Radio, and Ben Kiefer, from many of you know, from River to River, will also co-moderate. They'll be now telling you about the way the evening is going to work and introduce our speakers. So again, welcome everyone.
Well, Lynn and I are delighted to be here this evening and have this partnership with the University of Iowa Public Policy Center and the Des Moines Register. A little bit about the evening here. Tomorrow, an edited form of this conversation will air on my program, River to River, at noon. We can accommodate about 45 minutes. Of course, we have about 90 minutes, so it'll be somewhat condensed there as well. We look forward to taking your questions at about 8 o'clock. About an hour into this. We want to have this, rather than be a lecturely type of conversation, have it quick moving and exchange between the members of our panel. And so if you have a question, we have mics here and here. As we get towards 8 o'clock, if you'd like to come up here and have a nice concise thought or question to put to our panelists, that would be great. And I'm going to ask Lynn to introduce our panelists.
Hello, and thank you. I'm Lynn Hicks from the Register. And we have distinguished panelists here tonight, starting with Ronald McMullen. Ronald's a former career diplomat and U.S. ambassador to the state of Eritrea from 2007 to 2010, and he is the current ambassador in residence in the University of Iowa Department of Political Science. We also have Mary Kramer, who is a former Iowa State Senator and U.S. Ambassador to Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. That was from 2004 to 2006. And we have Bill Niebuhr. Bill is President and CEO of Origin Agritech, and he is the former Vice President and General Manager with strategic oversight responsibility for China, East Asia, and Oceania for DuPont Pioneer, who lived in China for several years. And Wenfeng Tong, the University of Iowa Professor of Political Science and International Studies, and your current research focuses on public opinion and political change in contemporary China. And Wenfeng, there are a lot of hot issues right now dealing with U.S.-China relations. Would you like to start us off by talking about that?
Yes. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I will start with my list of hot issues between China and the U.S. I may miss something that's on your mind, but at least I can think of 5 different things to start with. And the first one is North Korea. That's the hottest issue in the media in the past couple of weeks. Basically, the problem here is the U.S. think that China can solve the problem, and China says, no, it's really your problem. We can't really solve the North Korea problem and stop their missile and nuclear programs. So we can talk more. It's a complicated issue, but basically this is the difference between the two countries. The second issue is South China Sea. That's another hot issue. China considers South China Sea as part of China. So, but the U.S. think that it's international water, and China see that as the core interest for itself. there the U.S. doesn't, at least it doesn't seem to me that the U.S. think that it's a core interest of this country. So there's some room maybe the current administration would want to bargain with China. If you want this, and give me something else. So that's the second issue. The third issue is Taiwan, which China thinks is part of China, and President Trump shocked the world when he first got elected by answering a phone call from the Taiwanese president. No other, since the late 70s, no other U.S. president has ever done that. And so he received a phone call, and probably he was thinking this is also something that's on the bargaining table. We can bargain with China, with Taiwan. But China said, no, this is absolutely no room for bargaining. So President Trump retreated actually later by saying the U.S. official policy is that there's only one China. Taiwan is part of China. The other hot issue, it used to be hot, no longer hot, is the currency manipulation issue, right? If you remember during the campaign, candidate Trump repeatedly said he's going to name China a currency manipulator from day one. But he hasn't done so, and lately he told the media that China is helping the U.S. with North Korea, so he's not going to label China a currency manipulator anymore. So the final issue, hot issue, what maybe it's not as hot, if you listen to the confirmation hearing actually for Governor Branstad, and that came up as a hot issue as human rights. That issue seems to be missing actually during the presidential campaign. Even it came up during the confirmation hearing. I suspect that it's also probably is going to be in the back burner for a while.
From Professor Wang-Fong Tong, we move over to Bill Niebuhr, who has our business perspective, distinctly business perspective, who dealt a tremendous amount of time in China. Tell us what you summarize what you see in this conversation, and we'll just make sure you bring out the fact that you have done in China what is known here as the full Grassley. You visited not 99 counties in Iowa, but how many provinces in China?
Well, 34 that consider themselves autonomous.
Okay.
And independent. But so as I join you this evening, I also am honored to be here, and it's a great opportunity. Any chance that we get to speak about China and talk about the United States connected by something called the Pacific. Agriculture and agribusiness, as well as business, is really at a pivotal moment in the history of our two countries. We have been connected for a long time, but it now is moving to an interdependency and intertwining of our reliance on each other. And the thing to keep in mind is that as we entered the last century, we had a strong sense of nationalism in this country. And China possesses that same fervor for nationalism as we enter this new century. And we translated that further on into patriotism, which was really not a rivalry, but a love. And they're in the process of doing the same thing. So as we think today in the business sense of how we coexist, we have to acknowledge that we disagree on so many things because of our lack of a shared history. In the agribusiness sector, we have experienced from rural China to urban China the greatest migration of humankind in the history of the world. We have depopulated China the same way we've depopulated Iowa on a grander scale. And we've asked fewer and fewer individuals to feed more and more. And it is impossible to do that without a modernization effort. And so as we discuss tonight the business transitions and the intellectual property concerns that were brought out, and the food security and food safety, and the global complexity of systems that are not aligned working together, We need to continue to come back to the fact that it is inevitable and it is critically important that we find ways for these two superpowers, both militarily, economically, socially, environmentally, to protect our planet and to preserve our planet as we go forward. So I'll speak to you tonight as an agriculturalist first, a business person second, and an Iowan third. And we'll bring that back to our phenomenal opportunity that we have today with an ambassador, our most important ambassador, I would argue, coming from our home state.
Thank you, Bill Niebuhr. We'll move to Mary Kramer. As a former ambassador, would you share your thoughts on this topic?
I am happy to be here, and thank you all for coming to listen. I am a person that has an opinion about just about everything, and it's wonderful when someone asks me to share that. So we'll start that way. I had some memories yesterday because of my own hearing at the Foreign Relations Committee, and not necessarily the substance, but as I sat down in the big, black, tufted leather chair, I realized the chair is on a marble floor and my feet don't touch the floor. So I spent my entire hearing hanging onto the table in case the chair took me somewhere I didn't want to go. We have just remarkable set of people and expertise here tonight. And I come from the position of the woman from Iowa who unexpectedly was asked to serve as the ambassador to Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. Here are a couple of things I think we have in common. One is each of those small nations consider themselves very independent, and that independence is very fresh. When I was there, Barbados, the oldest of them, considered itself, had its 45th Independence Day. 93% of the Antiguans voted in the first election when I was there. Their liberty and their actions are so precious to them. It's refreshing. When Bill speaks about, when we speak about the full Grassley, for me that was 7 small nations, not 34 huge provinces. Nevertheless, each of them is governed, and part of the important role of the ambassador of the United States is to build a trust relationship with those elected officials, so when we need to talk to each other, whether it be on a happy topic or a not so happy topic, we are able to do that. It's a matter of finding even a little piece of common ground that we can both stand on and then see how we can expand that to get to where we're both feeling the win. So we'll be interested to participate tonight. Thank you.
Unlike Ambassador Kramer, Ambassador Ron McMullen is a career diplomat. So we have 2 ambassadors, but quite different perspectives. Tell us, what is your view, Ron?
I agree with Bill that the relationship between China and the United States is going to be the most important bilateral relationship for the 21st century and beyond. So Governor Branstad is going to play a key role in cementing a cooperative, I think, mutually beneficial relationship if things go the way he wants them to. Sometimes events and activities of other countries and unforeseen events throw off the best intentions, but it's clear that Governor Branstad wants to develop a cooperative, mutually beneficial relationship with China. Now, to be a successful ambassador, Governor Branstad will have to do at least 5 things well. He'll have to be a manager. He'll have to manage this important bilateral relationship, but he also has to manage people, things, and money. Our mission to China consists of over 2,000 employees. At last count, 673 of them were American citizens, representing 30 different federal government agencies. So Governor Branstad, who has had executive managerial experience as governor of Iowa for over 22 years, will be a natural at this. He is a good manager. He manages people, things, and money well. When the first Iowan to be ambassador to China served as ambassador, Edwin Conger from Dallas County, when he was there, he had a staff of 4. Governor Branstad will have a staff of over 2,000. Wuhan, where the one of our consulates is about as far from Beijing as Tallahassee, Florida is from Des Moines. So there'll be some geographic dispersion, 30 agencies, 2,000 people, the vast majority of whom will be Chinese citizens. So it will create new management challenges for the ambassador. The second thing that he'll have to succeed at is to be a persuader. Former Secretary of State said that diplomacy is persuasion in the shadow of power. Without power, diplomacy is just naked pleading. So Governor Branstad, as ambassador, will need to persuade the government of China, the people of China, and also third parties to find common interest in American interest and American values that are his job to promote these in China to both the government and to the people of China. He also has to be an advisor. While policy comes from Washington, policymakers in Washington traditionally have relied on the ambassador's advice from the field, the person who's wickered into the nerve center of that country, to be the key policy advisor for relations on that country. So Governor Branstad is going to have a real challenge because there are almost no senior appointments made in the State Department yet. There's also another node of influence with Jared Kushner being asked by President Trump to be his policy advisor on China. So how Ambassador Branstad is going to advise Washington it's going to be tricky. I'm sure he'll work it out, but it's not apparent how that's going to happen. A fourth thing is he has to be a host. Terry and Chris Branstad will probably host 20 to 25,000 people to their residence in the next 3 years. Every congressional delegation that comes through will want a reception at the ambassadors. The American embassy community will want to have Thanksgiving at the ambassadors. Official Chinese delegations coming in from the provinces will want to meet at the ambassador's residence. A lot of people visit Terrace Hill, beautiful governor's residence here in Des Moines, but they don't all expect to be met at the front door and to shake hands with Governor Branstad. So that will be a challenge for both Chris and Terry Branstad to host 20 or 25,000 people and to be the face and the persona of America in China for so many people. And lastly, he'll need to be a hard target. American diplomats walk around with a big bullseye painted on their back. Terrorists try to assassinate and kidnap ambassadors. Wackos do the same. North Korea in the past has targeted and successfully assassinated statesmen from other countries. So not only will he have a target on his back, but the governor, ambassador will be the target of espionage organizations throughout the world. China's many espionage organizations will target him personally. His car, his house, his domestic staff, his professional staff, his telecommunications, everything that he and Chris talk about over dinner needs to be carefully screened for classified information. Probably a majority of the 1,500 Chinese employees at the American Embassy have to report to Chinese intelligence agencies. So his challenge is going to be a hard target. Edwin Conger, the first Iowan to be ambassador in China, died 2 years after coming back, and the New York Times reported in his obituary that Mr. Conger died of a disease contracted in China. So we hope that that Ambassador Branstad will be a hard target, and will have to reach a balance between staying in that security bubble and getting out and meeting Chinese and American people across China to be able to be the best persuader he can be.
Thank you, Ron. Bill, we're going to start with you with a question. I know that you have met with Governor Branstad, and he has sought out your advice. So I'm curious, what did you tell him about what he should expect in this job and in China?
Well, Lynn, thanks. I've had the opportunity. I moved to Beijing in 2010 and lived there until late in 2015, early 2016. I had the opportunity on multiple occasions to meet with the governor under different auspices of the trade missions or political process or even agricultural missions. And we talked a lot about the differences and the challenges of effectively communicating on issues where we agree, as well as issues where we choose that we understand that we don't agree. And we talked about the choice of verbiage. And there's a lot of question today on how the ambassador will confront on this issue or that issue. And confrontation in China is not always a very effective strategy. There's a great Chinese saying that it's impossible to slap a smiling face. And so as one positions themselves, and we talked about this on finding areas of mutual interest and agreeing quickly on those and deeply on those so that we have the ability to expand into the adjacencies that exist where we disagree. And that we talked a lot about the importance of listening with Chinese ears and interpreting and extrapolating with an international mindset. And that you don't have much time to develop that, but at the same time, you can't hurry it. The challenges that we talked about were on timeline. How can we get the things done that we need to get done, but not push them so hard that they break? And then finally, we talked about life in Beijing. And I had the opportunity to live in two different Beijings, a Beijing pre-anti-corruption and a Beijing post-anti-corruption. And the anti-corruption is nothing that anyone can be really against from an ethical, moral perspective, but it has frozen the country in fear. That actions taken, be they the right actions or the appropriate actions, might be misinterpreted. And so we talked about the things in business, we talked about the things in policy, and we talked about the things in day-to-day living and what it was like to live in an air quality situation such as Beijing today, or a traffic situation. And it's a hard situation. It's very, and I have to tell you, having moved back to Iowa, I didn't appreciate how fortunate we are in the quality of life that we enjoy. And so we've had far-ranging conversations, and I hope that some of it's had some beneficial impact.
Bill, you said listening with Chinese ears. That's an interesting perspective to have to take up. Let's focus in on this president, and our Ambassador Branstad will be under this president. We have been listening with American ears to this president for over 100 days now, with various reactions to what has been said. I'm curious what those with experience on our panel with China think, listening with Chinese ears. Wenfeng, how is this? What are the Chinese making of our new president at this moment?
It really depends on what the president says about China. And if you go back to the presidential campaign last year, when he was bashing China, he wasn't very popular at all. But then recently, he met with the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, in Florida. And then he became very popular. And I do actually have a few quotes from Chinese internet users commenting on President Trump. I like this old dude more and more. He's super smart. I'm getting to all of a sudden, I really like this guy. He's so honest and straightforward. Trump's English is easy to follow. He speaks slowly, and his speech should be used as English lessons for listening materials. I really like him. He doesn't put around the bush, and you can see his personality in his speech. And this guy cannot be overlooked easily if he raised such excellent children, and if he created such a successful company.
But it's so fascinating that you have these Chinese people for the first time believe that they can have a relationship via tweets with the President of the United States. It's just unprecedented. And while they can't access tweets directly, they are rebroadcast. And you have a China today that is, I think, as we were speaking earlier tonight, just fascinated with this personality, not necessarily understanding it any better than we do at times.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Bill. And you talked about relationships, and that is that's so important in China. And Ron, I wanted you to talk a little bit about what we heard a lot in the hearing is Governor Branstad's relationship with President Xi Jinping, and how important is that, and how will that matter when he's in the job?
There's an old saying in diplomacy that relationships are not made in a crisis. So let's imagine in 2 months that there's a collision in the South China Sea, an American warship hits a Chinese fishing vessel, and the fishing vessel sinks. Suddenly, alarms are going off all across Southeast Asia, in China, and in the United States. Ambassador Branstad will be able to have access to the highest parts of the Chinese government, I believe, because he has a relationship established now with President Xi, thanks to the Landys here, Iowa and China, particularly President Xi, and other senior leaders will give Ambassador Branstad better access than almost anybody else. And I think that's why President Trump appointed him.
Mary Kramer, perhaps you could talk about the relationship of an ambassador to a president. You had a relationship with George W. Bush. How is that? Do you have direct contact with a president? Do you have to go through channels? What do you expect Governor Branstad, soon to be ambassador, will encounter in terms of a relationship with this president?
In terms of being a politically appointed ambassador, two things I thought gave me credibility at the very beginning. One is I had run for office, been elected, so I understood the pressures that go with political campaigns and the problem of dealing with multi-opinions in constituencies. So you understand that the grassroots are there, you have to deal with them. That's credibility right away. The other is not so much that I had a relationship with the president, but the fact that I was appointed by that president, given a mission to accomplish by that president, and that I could reach out and talk to that president if I needed to.
Did
That's
you talk
remarkably-
with George? Did you talk with the president often?
Yes, I did.
Do you have an
Yes.
instance to recount?
I do. It's lovely to be out of diplomacy now, so I don't have quite as many filters as I have had in the past. There was a new embassy under construction in Bridgetown, Barbados, and it was a bit of a euphemism. It had been under construction for 9 years. And so most of the island thought it was kind of the joke that we were never going to finish it. And I became impatient because the location where we were was environmentally awful. I was sending people home in respiratory distress. I cannot live with that. And so I went up the proper chain and was told, yes, it's going to happen and this and that. And then I realized they built a room for the backup generator that was so tight it only could run for 30 minutes. I don't think we're getting where we need to be here. So I called the White House, and it was a shock to everybody. But we got the thing turned around, and 8 months later, we completed the embassy building. I don't think I'd want to pull that trigger very often, but I thought it was enough of a problem that it was worth doing that one time. But having done that, then it appeared that, when I was the president of the Senate, I said, if you give me the gavel, I'm going to use it. So be sure you want me to be the president. And so if I had a phone call to the White House, the one time, I'm going to use it. And I think that would be especially important to the Chinese to know that the ambassador not only has a relationship with their president, but he also has a relationship with the President of the United States. And so those kind of communications become extremely important.
Bill, you want to elaborate on that? Because I think you were talking about the importance of the relationship to Governor Branstad's relationship to Xi as well as President Trump.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance on how you manage your guanxi or your connectivity or your relationships. You really have to treat this as a fixed asset. There's just a fixed amount of utilization that I can have, and so that I'll pull it out when I need that help. For the embassy team, the governor's relationship with the president is extraordinarily important for them to be able to accomplish their mission. They need to know that the president has the ambassador's back. And at the most recent governor's luncheon in Kansas City, the president called out the ambassador, the nominated ambassador, 4 times on 4 occasions, using Governor Branstad as an example. And this was not missed by the Chinese nor the embassy staff. And I know the embassy staff, after 5 years there, very, very well and very intimately, and they're excited about this appointment. They believe that this is an appointment that the president has made for the right reasons. And maybe just a side on that, as we come to food is something that the governor understands extraordinarily well, and trade equally. And these 2 issues, while on some of the hot lists and not on some of the others, are fundamental and foundational to a country of 1.4 billion. In my first meeting in China with our joint venture president, we had a conversation, and he said, "Dr. Niebuhr, have you ever been hungry?" As we were debating an issue and policy. And I said, "No, I grew up on a farm and I always had food." He said, "Well, then would you accept that you and I will never think about food the same way?" And I think that gets to the core of our building a relationship with this emerging superpower, is that their fundamental problems historically in terms of revolutions have all been started by angry farmers who are hungry and who had no opportunity. And so as we move forward, our governor and our next ambassador has such an enormous experience base and constituency base to pull from to help the Chinese make that transition from where we were in the 20s and 30s in this state to where they want to be in the 20s and 30s in their century. And this is foundational to what his opportunity is all about, and what is foundational to our need to support him in this new role. And so it's these differences that we continually need to keep in mind as we rush to snap judgments on why they said this or why they did that or what their policy or position is. I'm hard on China, don't get me wrong, and I'm soft on diplomacy. I think we have to push them hard, but we also have to understand that this is the long game. And the new ambassador is going to get to play about a quarter. And we need to give him a good quarter.
Unless you're like a couple of our panelists or maybe some out in the audience, you have no direct personal experience with China or perhaps even living abroad in a different culture. We can experience China, most of us, only through our media. I wonder what reflections from any of the panelists are about being here in Iowa, the portrayal we have of China through the media and the degree to which that matches the reality in China, particularly regarding its leadership. Wang Fong.
I'm not sure about just in Iowa, but if you read the national news in this country, and that is quite different from China, how U.S. is portraying China here. Just to give you one example, after the confirmation hearing in the Senate yesterday, and if you read the U.S. media, you will see the headlines like Branstad promised to uphold human rights values. Branstad promised to host dissidents in his residency in China. You know, that kind of values, I think, are well reflected there. But if you read the Chinese media, and it's all about friendship, it's all about goodwill. this old friend of China has been is very likely to be appointed as the ambassador to China, and he's going to do good things with China. He's to improve the relationship between the two countries. So that's just one example, and I think the same event can be portrayed in very different ways by the media in each country.
Thank you, Wenfeng. Ron, I think the Chinese are sitting about trying to figure out what the Trump foreign policy is, as is the rest of the world. And can you talk about, what are some differences? It seems like the Trump administration is departing from many of the norms of diplomacy. And can you talk about how that differs from past administrations?
President Trump is a multimillionaire who made his fortune in business. And as a result, I think he has a transactional view of diplomacy and international relations, that what are we going to get out of this relationship? Can you get a little bit and we get more of what we want out of a transactional relationship? In the past, most American presidents have had a values-based foreign policy to promote American democracy and to uphold human rights, as well as to promote specific U.S. interests in countries and regions of the world. So I was very pleased to hear Governor Branstad say that every day he will represent to the Chinese government and to the Chinese people the importance of American values. And he listed human rights as number one, followed by free and open trade, an order-based, a rule-based order for the ocean surrounding China, a nod towards the South China Sea, and lastly, free press. And you're off to China this week to help promote free press in China?
I'm leaving Tuesday, and
right.
Yes, I'll be there for 10 days, and yes, I'll be meeting with some journalists there who are actually doing interesting investigative reporting there. So,
okay. So while President Trump hasn't talked much about promoting American values, Governor Branstad did in his hearing yesterday. And also we see that when one of the most striking actions that, no pun intended, that President Trump has ordered was the missile strike on Syria. And it wasn't because of a particular U.S. interest. It was a U.S. value about using chemical weapons. I mean, there was no particular U.S. interest involved in there. It was a humanitarian, institutional, multilateral world agreement that countries won't use chemical weapons. And so Trump's actions don't always match his words. And sometimes his actions are better than his words. Not always, but sometimes. And so we see this mercurial foreign policy, at least now. I think as staffing gets filled out in the foreign affairs agencies, that we're going to see a regression towards the norm, towards the mean of a more orthodox foreign policy, as opposed to some of the more unorthodox statements he made, particularly during the campaign.
Mm-hmm. Do you see that as well, Mary Kramer, as a former ambassador, here that we have such a departure as a president? If you were in the shoes of Governor Branstad, what would be your greatest concerns? Being blindsided by an offhand remark that President Trump might make, for instance?
It doesn't take much. There are congressional comments that resonate around the world that we don't hear about or think about. But my husband was very active in the Rotary clubs in the Eastern Caribbean. It was perhaps he was a better ambassador than I along those lines. But the idea was he would go to a Rotary meeting and there would be people asking him about something that somebody said on CNN 30 minutes before. And so I think it's always been the case that everything we do and say is out there. On the other hand, as a diplomat, I sort of you can't hit a smiling face. I really worked at mastering the art of endlessly pleasant, because it just is very difficult. And it's futile to really expect people to do things they do not think are in their best interest.
Did you
And
learn
it's-
that in the state legislature?
Yes.
Being in the
I did that, and it served me well. But it was the idea that how do we find that common ground? How do we find that little piece where we have agreement so that we might be able to move an agenda forward, even a little bit? But it was because we were both hand in hand going in that direction.
Wen Fong, yeah.
The two leaders in the two countries may have a lot of differences between them. But probably there's one thing I see, at least I see, is they have in common, that is pragmatism. I think the Chinese government and Chinese leadership has been known for being pragmatic, and they are willing to make deals. And the same is true with President Trump. And he's a businessman. He might surprise people with his daily tweets. However, if you think in a business point of view, I sometimes I think about the similarity between his book, The Art of Deal Making, and The Art of War by Sun Tzu. You know, there's a lot of similarities there.
If you had a Chinese man with the same personality, let's just try to transpose Donald Trump into China, what would people think of him as a business leader? The way he talks, the way he pursues business interaction?
I think people think him as direct. And also people think, as I just quoted, he's smart and he's a successful businessman.
Bill Niebuhr.
No,
Well,
I think that's exactly right. The Chinese presidents don't come out of the Iowa caucus. With all due respect to the Iowa caucus, these are individuals that are groomed, and I've had the opportunity to speak to young business professionals during my stay in China, and young political professionals, and the two groups couldn't have been more different in terms of their preparations, their educations, and their formations. And this new president is a negotiator, and he's an effective negotiator because you have no idea what he's thinking or what he might do next. Additionally, you really don't know what his BATNA is, his best alternative to no agreement. You don't know his fallback stance. And this has these career politicians very perplexed as they're trying to interpret what went on at our winter White House. It is really right now very unique in its setting, and I think we're all learning, collectively learning, that how this relationship will mature, because it will be very, very different than where it's been for the first half of this decade.
Well, that brings us to the big issue, which Wen Fong talked about earlier, and that is North Korea and this U.S. strategy of putting pressure on China to do something about North Korea, about the missile testing and their nuclear program. Ron, how successful do you think that strategy will be?
Well, I think that right now the Trump administration is counting on Governor Branstad to deliver China on North Korea. I think President...
No pressure.
Yeah. So Wen Fong mentioned that the currency manipulation charge has fallen away. And also, we may, again, the dog that didn't bark. In January, the U.S. Pacific Command asked permission to do a freedom of navigation sail within 12 miles of a reef that China has built into an island illegally. And Washington refused that sail-by, that freedom of navigation sail-by. In February, PACOM requested twice to do a freedom of navigation sail-by within 12 miles of a reef made into an island illegally. Both times, Washington said no. So I think even in the South China, the list of hot button issues that Wen Fong mentioned earlier, I think all of them are going to be back burner issues until we can see if Governor Branstad can deliver China on North Korea. I don't think he's going to be able to. And at that point, what happens? At that point, the honeymoon will be over. I mean, China does not want a united democratic country allied with the U.S. on its doorstep. It does not want chaos in North Korea with 10 million North Korean refugees fleeing across its border. Think of how much trouble China has caused South Korean companies and entertainers simply for agreeing to deploy a nuclear missile shield in South Korea. So I don't think Governor Branstad is going to be able to deliver China on North Korea. And at that point, the honeymoon ends, I'm afraid.
Bill Niebuhr, I see you vigorously nodding your head there in agreement, but it is interesting when Ron talks about China's position, if it looks at a possible collapse of North Korea, what would be the position of China there? How do you see that, the problem from the Chinese perspective?
Well, I think Ron is exactly right. This is such a massive issue that any one individual is able to create some momentum, but to culminate it in the time frames that we're talking about is going to be extraordinarily difficult. China recognizes that it has a problem on that border, and as was mentioned, a migration of 10 million into 1.4 billion, seems it's a lot of people, but they assimilate fairly quickly. And they will move throughout the country. And so what I think China recognizes is that this is a problem in their part of the world, but it's on their time frame. And they will respond very quickly. The thing that really impressed me in my time there is that things happen slowly, but when they happen immediately. The response is swift, it's complete, and if it's a problem, it goes away. And most have no idea where the problem went, whether it be an individual on a corner, a problematic province, or maybe a politician who gets out of line. Things are dealt with. And so I agree completely with Ron. I think this is a major risk factor for this new ambassador in his early days.
It's about much more than trade. We see that the governor takes a huge amount of expertise about trade, and particularly trade that feeds people. Mm-hmm. But the ambassadorship is involved in so many more issues than trade, and how we communicate that. It's when you talk about listening, it is not so important what is said as it is what is heard. And I think in this case, it'll be what is heard, and we may not know exactly, as you say, how it gets dealt with.
Wen Fong.
I would agree with what Ron said about China not tolerating a democratic, unified Korea. But I would frame it slightly differently from the Chinese point of view. The Chinese don't see that as a democratic country. The Chinese would see it as a country under the American influence, American control. That's how they see the threat. If you go back to the Korean War, the reason China entered the Korean War was because the U.S. troops were pushing very close to the Chinese border. So for China, I think the bottom line is it cannot tolerate a Korean peninsula under the American control. I think from the Chinese point of view, the only solution is not military solution. The United States has to sit face to face with North Korea and negotiate.
Okay, and because you've said that you don't think that China is capable of doing what the U.S. wants?
Correct. For the Chinese, I think there's there's a lot of I think this is Chinese president told President Trump. There's a lot of historical animosity between the two countries. Whatever China does is perceived by North Korea as an attempt to control North Korea. So they're very, very. The Chinese government has to be really careful whatever it does.
With a mix of diplomatic expertise and knowledge and experience with China on this panel, also regarding North Korea here, we've all been sort of anxious to one degree, very anxious perhaps, about what we could wake up to tomorrow. How close do you feel we are to really having a military engagement with North Korea? Is it overhyped in the press? Is it about right? Wang Fong.
I think it's part of the art of deal making is bluffing more than real, because if you think about it, I'm no military expert, but the border, the 38 parallel is 30 miles, I think, from the South Korean capital, Seoul, and they can use conventional weapons to attack South Korea. So if the U.S. does not have the confidence to wipe out the entire North Korean military power, then they will retaliate. There will be heavy losses in South Korea, possibly in Japan. So I don't see that as an option. So I think negotiation is the only way to solve the problem between the U.S. and North Korea.
Yeah, I think that the North Korea represents really quite a unique situation versus a problematic Stan or a dry country in the Middle East or a place where people don't typically go or we don't have population centers. I think that what Wen Fong has just laid out is that you have a technologically incompetent situation here playing with a population center of the world in Japan and the Koreas and China, and this puts it on a completely different plateau as I think about how we need to approach this. And a unilateral sort of after dinner activity would be, I think, very ill-advised at this moment into that particular geography. And I'm not sure what others think, but that it's a huge insecurity for me. I couldn't imagine what was going to get me to worry less about Iran and a few other places, but it's emerged.
Ron, how do you assess the risk?
North Korea has taken provocative actions, seizing the USS Pueblo and launching missiles and doing all kinds of things that I think have to do with securing regime support and regime security in North Korea. The United States and South Korea and Japan and China have all, I think, refrained from rising to the bait. And I hope that President Trump continues to do that in the face of the next provocation. I think throughout the Trump administration, there's a realization that the United States has almost no good options regarding North Korea. As Wen Fong and Bill have said, there are maybe 1,200 conventional artillery tubes dug into stone cliffs that could level Seoul, a city of 20 million people, in a 3-hour barrage. So I think that's why the hope is that maybe Governor Branstad can deliver China to solve our North Korea problem. It's the only good, and that's not really a very plausible option, but it's the only option that anybody, I think, focuses on right now with some hope of success. I think it's misplaced, frankly.
Might be a good time to remind our audience that if you have any questions, so much we've talked about here, certainly some good questions out there. I'm sure if you'd like to go up to the microphones, we'll sort of wind up the questions here and get to microphones on the left and the right of our auditorium here in just a moment. I wonder if there's anything to add before we go to questions from the audience about an ambassador's role in a time of crisis, in a time of tension, and perhaps how that changes. Reflections, insights there? Mary Kramer.
My experience is such a smaller scale relative to all of this Nevertheless, the island of Grenada was absolutely destroyed in a hurricane during my term, and the government could not be found, and so we were able to move ahead. But at the core of it all is the biggest fear in countries, small and large, is of regime change, and that the regime change would come from outside. And I think that is really what motivates leaders and officials in many countries. And when we keep that in mind, we at least have a little better clue about what the motivation really is.
Can I say that whole North Korea issue is more urgent but less important than the U.S.-China bilateral relationship?
Explain what you mean by that.
I mean, we could have an incident tomorrow or tonight as we're speaking here that puts American lives and security at risk in the Korean Peninsula. But as some of us said, the relationship with China, getting it right now, as China is a rising power seeking to take its place in global affairs, getting that right now will have more to have a bigger influence on the 21st century prosperity and peace in America than any other relationship. And so maybe we could look at Korea as being sort of a symptom of the China-U.S. relationship. Can we cooperate? Can we find a way to cooperate to corral this rogue nation without destroying a very prosperous and strategically important corner of the world?
All right, thank you. Well, we have lots of questions, it looks like, so.
We have about a half an hour left, so again, a reminder to please pare down your questions to their essence, and we'll have hopefully as many as time permits. We have about a half an hour for this, so I guess we'll go over to here. And please, before you ask your question, please tell us your name and where you're from.
Anthony Meyer. I'm from Bettendorf, graduated from Drake. Go Bulldogs. How do you see Governor Branstad's relationship with President Xi affecting the Chinese joint venture system? And that can be for like insurance or just general.
Bill has expertise in that area.
You know, it's very interesting. The foreign direct investment, or the FDI, as we refer to it lovingly as, is variable across multiple industries depending upon their strategic significance. The agricultural area is defined by requiring companies from non-Chinese sources being in a minority stake. So, you know, I lived under the JV regime and worked with the joint venture regime for 5 years. I loved the partner. I hated the JV. It's a very cumbersome structure, as you're suggesting with your question. But at this point, it just reflects a strong sense of insecurity on their ability to create local champions, to create local entities that are competitive on a global scale. And in a world with Huawei and Alibaba and, you know, Lenovo, we say, how can that be? And it's changing. It's changing quickly. But until there's some greater parity, the joint venture structure will remain in selected industries. I just real quickly, I'm asked frequently, how far behind is China in this technology or that technology? And I quickly say that, you know, that's really, I can answer that question for you, but it will leave you with the wrong impression. The more important question is, how long will it take for them to catch up?
Another
From where
question.
they are.
Yes,
So that's
sir. Yes, sir. Your name and your question, please.
My name is Jack Kinsel, and I'm a farmer, retired farmer from Northern County. I happen to be, and I see some of the hosts are here, I happen to be one of the farmer hosts of Xi Jinping when he came here in 1985. Little did I know that I'd go on to farm 30 years and he'd go on to be the president of China. But that being said, did have the opportunity to go back over there 5 years ago with the governor and the group from Muscatine and that group, and it was a great trip. But my question is, and more towards agriculture, and there's two things. One, you hear that, and maybe you can answer, that 20% of China's land, or I don't know if it's all farmland, is contaminated where they, you know, with metals and stuff that they can't grow crops. And then on a follow-up on that, we always read and hear, and if you talk to a lay person in the street, they think China's going to own the United States. But if you look at if you read deeply in some of the lending practices they have, could they be setting themselves up for 2008 and 9?
Well, great questions, and something that's very dear to me. To come first off to the land and the environmental concerns. The environmental concerns in China are real, they're serious, and they're threatening. The industries have moved away from regulated areas to more rural areas because they can operate more profitably, but much more negatively from an environmental perspective. The heavy metal concentrations in many of the rice growing areas are real and significant. There's been a lot made that China's average corn yield is half of the North American yield, and thus they're forced to farm in very different ways. But let's keep in mind that half of China's corn is double crop corn, planted after wheat. So it's naturally going to be at a lower yield level. But Chinese farmers with modern technology and modern seed and the right resources, and this is where I come to your lending question, can compete with anyone in the world. Lending is a major issue. It is the financial situation right now. It's very difficult for large-scale operators. One of the reasons that it remains as a peasant farming system is it's been very difficult to reach rural credit. And when rural credit has come out, it's been very difficult to collect on those loans. So from the rural to the urban, the financial system today is in a real state of transition and flux. China has been able to handle that with its trade surplus, and it continues to fix some of these problems or put Band-Aids over them. But you're on the crux of things. Land allocation and financing are really impediments to modern agriculture. And I'll turn it over to Ron.
Can I just say something on environmental quality in China? In 2000, one of U.S. Embassy's primary objectives is to protect and assist American citizens overseas. 2008, Embassy Beijing began to put an air quality monitor on the roof of the embassy to count the free particulates in the air that could be harmful to lungs. And the readings would be instantly, automatically tweeted to American citizens. Now, Chinese citizens can't access Twitter. It's banned by the Communist Party along with other social medias. But as the American embassy was tweeting how bad air pollution was, it went off the charts. And the American embassy began to refer to this as crazy bad. And it kind of caught on among Chinese citizens, and particularly people who had these tweets retweeted to them. And so it's one way. Spring is good in Beijing, right? But winter can be soupy and smoggy and foggy and dangerous, like smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day, just breathing the air. So it's going to be a challenge for Governor Branstad and his family, as it is for everybody who lives in Beijing, to work to improve the quality of life and the environment in China.
For a period of time, the air quality was so bad that the Foreign Service was recommending that families with small children, Foreign Service officers, do not apply to go to China because it was not a good thing for their children and their families, and that's a major statement.
Having lived in this for 5 years, there can be no exaggeration of what's being described here.
Let's go to our next question. Sir, your name, where are you from?
I'm Jim Walters from Iowa City, also a retired farmer. I want to preface my question by saying I'm really proud to be a resident of Johnson County. We're the only county in the state of Iowa that has never voted for Terry Branstad. And perhaps that's because of our high educational standards, but perhaps it's also because of the fact that we knew him so well when he was here as a student. Here in the People's Republic of Johnson County, we take foreign relations very seriously, especially as they pertain to the People's Republic of China. Arguably, as you've all pointed out, it's the most important relationship that we have. Many people have concerns about Governor Branstad's health situation. We have now elected the oldest president of the United States, and people have concerns about his fitness. Should this most important diplomatic mission be entrusted to a man of Governor Branstad's age and health condition?
Is there any
Ron,
test for ambassadors as to health or anything that you're put through, any kind of
Yes.
scrutiny, Mary?
Yes, there's, at the end of the process to become an ambassador, that you have absolutely no secrets, and that includes every detail of your health situation, every detail, and and there's no detail of any financial situation that escapes notice and measurement. My measurement is this: at the end of the application process, and I warned Governor Branstad about this, I had a stack of completed forms that reached 14 inches. And it just kept on and kept on. So somebody knows and is still making a judgment about whether it's appropriate for a man of that age and whatever health status to serve in this position.
Okay, so we'll go to our next question. Go ahead, sir. Your name, where you're from.
My name is Klaus Ruprecht. I'm a retired German diplomat. I served altogether 8 years in Beijing. And during that time, I watched US-China relations very closely. They have been difficult in the best of times. Just think back of President Clinton, President Bush, and so forth. And my question to the colleagues, my former colleagues, is the structural problem in the State Department. Even in good times, the embassy in Beijing had difficulties getting their viewpoint through to the administration. And the American diplomats were highly qualified. I had the highest respect for them. But often they said, we don't get through. And we have a State Department now that has not filled a lot of positions. How will that problem be solved? One good example is we don't have an ambassador in Korea at this moment. Can you imagine that? In such a crisis, there is no US ambassador in Korea. And there is a man of Mr. Branstad background in Beijing.
What do our former ambassadors have to say to that concern?
It is true that it is difficult to get ambassadors in place. The length of the confirmation process has something to do with that. I took 8 months and was told that it was remarkably brief. So, and it is disappointing that the attention to ambassadorships is perhaps not leading us there, but I think maybe Ron would like to talk a little bit about the structural of State Department, so he's way more experienced and expert than I.
Can I ask our questioner, in the German diplomatic service, what portion of ambassadors are politically appointed and not career diplomats?
The percentage is close to zero.
Okay.
Because we have a career diplomatic service, and in very rare cases we have political appointees, but I could tell you probably 5 from my experience in 10, 15 years.
Lucky German diplomats. In the United States, we have the highest proportion of political appointees of any major country. It's typically been about 30% of our ambassadors are political appointees who have no diplomatic experience, like my good friend Mary Kramer. Many have purchased their ambassadorships by huge contributions to political campaigns. And career diplomats who serve under a politically appointed ambassador, the default setting is that the incoming ambassador will be deemed incompetent until proven otherwise. So that will be one of the challenges that Terry Branstad will face, to show that he knows how diplomacy works. And I think anybody from Embassy Beijing that watches confirmation hearings will have some of their fears mitigated because of his very strong and diplomatic performance at this confirmation hearing. So the Trump administration has left about 50 of the top positions in the State Department vacant. Sometimes there was in a handful of those, there was a career diplomat who had risen to a position, Assistant Secretary or Undersecretary of State in the State Department, and they were asked to leave those positions, but there have been no nominees except for Deputy Secretary of State. There have been no nominees at the Undersecretary level or the Assistant Secretary level, and there have been only 2 confirmed ambassadors, David Friedman to Israel. Governor Branstad has not yet confirmed. Nikki Haley to the United Nations. Scott Brown, former senator from Massachusetts, has been announced but not nominated for New Zealand. Why New Zealand? Will Haggerty, who was in charge of President Trump's transition team, got himself nominated to be ambassador to Japan to replace Caroline Kennedy. Woody Johnson, who's the multimillionaire heir of the Johnson & Johnson company, decided that thanks to his contributions, he'd like to be ambassador to the Court of St. James in England, in the UK. So apart from that, there's almost nobody there.
Is that the fault of the Trump administration or foot dragging on part of the Democrats who are part of okaying these people to be in their positions?
There have been no nominations. I mean, the people that I just mentioned, that's it. Out of 119 State Department positions, vacancies that require Senate confirmation, there have been, I think, 7. Yeah, John Huntsman has been announced. So in diplomacy, the White House announces their intention to nominate someone for an ambassadorship. And then the State Department asks that country for something called agrément. Will you accept this person as ambassador? So Russia hasn't gotten back to the State Department yet saying, yes, we'll accept John Huntsman as ambassador to Moscow. And so once we get agrément from Russia, then the nomination will be official and the Senate confirmation hearing can be scheduled. So John Huntsman is another one of those. Again, former ambassador to China, very experienced, very capable, political appointed ambassador.
You haven't given me an answer. How is this going to play out in China, and especially with relation to North Korea?
When I talked about that, the ambassador will need to be an advisor on policy. And right now there's a problem because there's an acting assistant secretary for East Asia Pacific Affairs, a career diplomat, but she doesn't have the ear of the president. Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, probably has dinner with him 4 nights a week. I don't know, but he's close. He also has been asked by President Trump to sort of be the liaison with relations with Canada, Mexico, the Middle East peace process, and China. China is putting lots and lots of focus on Jared Kushner right now as somebody who has better access and perhaps more influential with the White House than Embassy Beijing. So that will be one of the challenges that Ambassador Branstad, when he gets to Beijing, is going to have to figure out. It's not going to be easy because of the lack of structure in the State Department right now.
Good evening. My name is Kate Corcoran, and I live here in Iowa City. My question is, I guess I'd like you to kind of throw some historical perspective on what you've been talking tonight, because I wonder to what extent you feel that the conditions in the Korean Peninsula that you have very astutely described are a result of the fact that the war there ended in an armistice, and that did we not wrap things up there properly? I mean, what happened? We're like 60-some years later from the end of the armistice that marked the end of the Korean War, and I wondered, looking back, did we make some mistakes? Did the world? Thank you.
I think the simple answer is that North Korea is not sitting there quietly and it keeps testing missiles. That's everyone else wants to keep it the way it is since 1952. China definitely wants the status quo. It doesn't want anything to change. The U.S. doesn't want any new trouble. But I think I may be wrong, but the media in this country portray North Korea as a crazy place, right? A crazy country with crazy leaders, irrational. But if you live in North Korea, you see the military exercise between Japan, the U.S., and South Korea several times a year, you would be scared too. I would be scared. So I think North Korea is trying to develop its own defense capacity, but that becomes a threat to the neighbors, to the superpowers. So I think that could be one answer to the question.
Wenfang, is there any deal you can imagine the North Korean leadership accepting to give up its pursuit of nuclear weapons and missiles that could potentially reach the U.S. mainland?
I keep thinking about the Clinton administration. Under the Clinton administration, there was a deal, and the U.S. would help North Korea economically. So North Korea agreed to stop its nuclear program. But then George W. Bush came into power and said, no, we're not going to honor that agreement. So then North Korea said, okay, then we're going to keep testing missiles.
Another question. We have about 15 minutes left. Who would like to step to the microphone with another question? Yes. Sir, your name, please. Where are you from?
My name is Nick Ravas. I am a chemical engineering student at the University of Iowa. And in a lot of my classes, we're dealing with the topic of sustainability. And I was just wondering, out of curiosity, the current outlook on the smog situation in China, are there any solutions currently being developed? How high of a priority is that in terms of the issues that you guys are dealing with? And what kind of concerns we have for the overall quality of life for people living in Beijing and areas affected by that?
You know, it's a great challenge in the form of a question to think about, you know, in the 80s where we were with Los Angeles and where we were when we were a coal-based economy in many parts of the Midwest and where China is today. We dreaded winter in China because we knew coal was going to be burnt, and winter was declared on a certain day based on a number of temperature regimes that had occurred, and then coal was allowed to be burned. And we knew that the coal contained sublethal levels of arsenic. And when we went outside, we were exposing ourselves to individuals using coal as a supplemental heat to their buildings where the systems were inadequate. And so it was people making a choice to be warm or to be at risk. And lung health is one that sort of sneaks up on you later on in life, and it affects your demographics. And we're seeing that demographic situation in China emerge today from long-term unsustainable practices around energy and also around growth. The urbanization that I described earlier is creating megapolises in China, concentrations of people that this planet has never seen before, who want to live as we live in Iowa City or Ames or Des Moines. They want to have 3 cars per family. They can only drive their one car every other day in Beijing, so they get a second car, so they can drive every day. And if you contrast that to riding the subway or being in a bus on a 35 degrees Celsius day, it's a pretty, even if you're stuck in traffic for 3 hours, it's a great change. And so it's an inevitable consequence in a country of that size where its rounding number, 0.4 billion, is larger than this country. You have people who aspire to a better quality of life, and they're willing to sacrifice the long term for the short term. And so, but the country is acutely aware of this. And the leaders recognize that building cement factories and coal systems on the outskirts of Beijing, steel, 50% of the world's steel is produced in China today. 25% of China's steel is produced within 50 kilometers of the center of Beijing. And it was because they needed it to efficiently grow their infrastructure at the rate that it needed to grow to accommodate the people that were flooding into Beijing or Shanghai or Nanjing or Hunan or Wuhan or where have you. So it really is an issue that they're starting to address. they're coming up with wind tunnels in Beijing today. They're building fans, large fans in Beijing, and clearing trees, clearing buildings to create places where they can blow all of that pollution to Korea. Yeah, and so, or Japan, or ultimately across the Pacific. But that's a short-term fix. But it is, as you suggest, a real problem. And my father used to love to say that anything non-sustainable will one day stop. And so the Chinese recognize this, and I believe that they're taking the actions. But it is, in a democracy, it's impossible at times to operate. But in their system of government, if there's a decision taken to move in a certain direction, they will move. And I never underestimate the Chinese ability to effect change and to deal with an issue. It may not be the way we would, but they'll deal with it. Ron?
I was going to flip the coin and look at China adding sustainability to Iowa. 150 yards behind us is the University of Iowa power plant, which is fired by natural gas, wood chips, oat hulls from Quaker Oats, and coal. Increasingly around the People's Republic of Johnson County, you see giant fields of miscanthus grass imported from China that the University of Iowa is experimenting with to add another renewable fuel to replace the fossil fuels of natural gas and coal being used to power the University of Iowa. So it may be that in 10 years or less, that an imported fuel from a renewable fuel from China will power the University of Iowa.
How do you spell irony?
Hi, my name is Daniel Williams. I'm a student here from Cedar Rapids. I guess I'm curious about what the current state of the diplomatic relationship between Russia and China is, and should we be worried about collusions between Russian and Chinese hackers? I saw a headline that Trump had claimed that it could have been Chinese hackers who hacked the DNC. Is that like, how does that affect the relationship, I guess, with U.S. and China? And is that plausible at all? And how close are Russia and China in this regard, the cyber intelligence thing?
Yeah. I don't know the cyber cooperation between Russia and China. There might be something there, but I would say I think the U.S. should be worried, should be concerned about the increasingly close relationship between Russia and China. They're voting the same way in the United Nations. And their leaders are visiting each other a lot more frequently than Chinese leaders visit the United States. Historically, China and Russia were allies in the 50s, right? And there's a short period of time, then there's some conflict between the two countries, but I find it increasingly you see that the two countries are getting closer in terms of international cooperation, conflict with the West.
I think it's interesting as China emerges as an international force, there's a sense of improving its national perspective of itself, its self-image, but there's also a need to take on world order. And so we've sort of enjoyed since the glasnost and perestroika and some other things, sort of a unique position in establishing what world order looks like. Well, if China emerges to have significant influence on Africa, as well as Southeast Asia, what will that global order look like? And I know, Ron, I'd be interested, you and Mary, in your thoughts, because we've had Pax Americana for some time now, and what will transpire when China decides that it also has an accountability and responsibility in global order?
Do you want to answer that?
I don't exactly think there is an answer to that, and I'm not of a generation that can speak intelligently about cyber techniques and hacking, but I don't think anything is impossible or even unlikely. And I have said very often, if anyone thinks there is privacy available engaged in computer technology, then I disagree. I don't think there is. So we should just be prepared that it's out there and we manage forward. The issue that I think about in terms of smaller nations, and in many ways I view that, is that I watched the Chinese ambassadors to the Caribbean do a complete change. The ambassador who was in Barbados when I first arrived was a lovely man with his wife was with him, and they had no English, they had no interest in social interaction, so they were not a part of the diplomatic corps and so forth. The man that followed him was educated in America. His wife was an attorney. They spoke English, the English that is spoken in the islands, fluently. They entertained lavishly. It was a complete different face of a country to that part of the world. I found that kind of startling, and I think it speaks to your notion that the Chinese see themselves appropriately as players on the international, as impactful players on the international stage.
A quick answer to this, perhaps, Bill, with your experience in China, is Mandarin necessary for Branstad? Does he have to know any basic, have any workable knowledge of Mandarin?
It was a great advantage for Ambassador Huntsman to have studied the language and to know the language. But for Ambassador Branstad, I believe that he should study the culture, study the issues, and understand the Chinese perspective. We'll let Chris learn the language and let her do the day-to-day haggling and negotiation in the dirt market. But we need Governor to focus on the issues. The friendly Chinese that we use at dinner will come quickly for him. I think the guy's fine. I spent a lot of time with him. I think he's fine. And he's sharp and he's bright and he's quick and he's got a lot of ambition and he wants this job. So I appreciate the question, but I think he'll be all right.
Perhaps one more question we have time for. Yes, sir. Your name and where are you from?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm Zian from China. I'm a student, the sophomore student for the international relations major. And I have a question about because we are talking about human rights, because I'm really impressed with that. But I have a question whether because we're supposed to think the North Korean will to bomb themselves. So the human rights is about the rest of the people on the earth, other countries, and also the threat of China. But if we the Chinese government play the role, positively they play a role to negotiate with the North Korea, and if there are any possibilities about North Korea will bomb China if they do that, and also if the North Korea almost the only threatens in the East Asian area. So if this is threatened or already being eliminated, so is there any possibility that the American will lose some of the influence in the East Asia about Japan and South Korea? And if it does, will American will have another choices for that? Thank you.
Okay, but only about 6 parts to that question. Does anybody want to take a stab at any part of that question?
American influence there, influence in East Asia. While President Trump believes that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade deal with 11 countries, would cost American workers jobs, and therefore announced his disinclination to move forward with it, it's left a lot of people who signed up for TPP uncertain about American staying power. The advantage of TPP, in my view, was that it would establish international high standards for trade, protection of environment, labor, intellectual property. And the U.S. would have been advantaged by having American rules as the norm in Asia. Because of our withdrawal from TPP, it's likely that a Chinese order, a Chinese set of international trading rules and performance rules will become the norm. And the U.S. as a unreliable rulemaker and enforcer of international order in that part of the world, I think will do real damage to the U.S. and allow China a great opportunity to make the rules and establish the rules it sees most advantageous for its own case.
Thank you. All right. We are almost out of time, and so I'd like to wrap up by having our panelists sum up some final thoughts, starting with Win Fong. What are your hopes and fears in U.S.-China relations going forward?
I would like to say that, well, everyone says that China and U.S. are so important, two important countries, and they are so closely related, codependent with each other. They cannot live without each other. I think but I would be a little more pessimistic. I would like to point out some barriers between these two countries. According to the art of war, you have to know your enemy if you want to deal with your enemy, right? And I think one barrier I can see is cultural difference. China has a long Confucian tradition. This culture is very much group-oriented culture. In Western society, it's a liberal, individualistic culture. So these two different sets of values would be in conflict with each other. The second problem between the two countries is political. And the U.S. has to go through this electoral cycle, right? Frequent change of leadership and change of foreign policy, but the Chinese system focuses more on stability and continuity. So that's going to be another problem dealing with the two countries. The third one, I think, is the one some of the panelists referred to. That is the problem of a rising new power and old power being in control of the world order. Right? And the new power sometimes doesn't want to play the rules according to the existing power. So how do you deal with this? How to keep this balance would be another problem.
Bill Niebuhr, your concluding remarks here. Hopes and fears, I guess.
Well, for me, I guess I'd come into the fundamental challenge we face on anything that involves rights. We as a country have struggled with our north, south, east, west, rich, poor definitions on rights, whether they be human rights or they be intellectual property rights. And the thing I guess I've been impressed by in my working career and my life is that the haves have a certain perspective and the have-nots have another. And it is to our advantage to move as many people globally as we can to the have status, and in a way that is environmentally responsible, and I think ecologically and humanistically appropriate. If our true goal is to improve the human condition in both of our countries and in the surrounding countries that we operate with, then we'll find ways to recognize our differences and not be convicted to changing everything about the other side. And so my worry is that we continue to play the ally versus the adversary, as the question was posed yesterday in the hearings. We have to accept that we're both. We aspire to do things that each of us want to do, and that to achieve that, it's not zero sum. It can be that we win-win. And it can be that we ultimately build a global order that is not one viewpoint, but a multiplicity of views, one that embraces diversity. And we will survive this administration. We will go on and we will move and we will evolve and we will survive this century. And our children's children will really live off of the decisions that we make over the second half of this first half of the century. So I have a lot of optimism. And I, like Mary, we're in a similar generation. You know, the best is yet to come. And the opportunity to address these problems today with the experience base that we have is what gives me great hope and great optimism, and what draws us to this center of education, center of learning called the University of Iowa, where people who will ultimately inherit this will emanate from. So I have my fears, but my optimism far outweighs my insecurity.
Mary Kramer, I see you nodding at Bill's
Yes.
optimism.
I share that optimism. I always think that the best is yet to come, and I also subscribe to something I call the theory of abundance, which means that if we actually believe in and act on that we are all better if everyone has an opportunity to rise. If all boats rise, then the pie gets bigger, and it's not just the game of how are you going to cut it, because if it stays the same, the only game in town is what size if my piece gets bigger, yours is going to get smaller. And that is built-in conflict. So let me give just one small example. In the Caribbean, some of those countries are so small, their number one revenue is tourism, which is not an encouraging thought. But the U.S. has given equipment for this and that. Well, it's a fishing economy. And at one point, there was one of my countries that could not even perform a search and rescue. Now, if you think about that, that makes the government impotent. So what shall we do? The Coast Guard tells me we had given them all kinds of equipment, and it's completely broken and can't be used. So the answer is, the equipment comes, our people sit with their people, and they learn to use that equipment, not only to use it, but to repair it. So when we leave it with them, they are independent and are confident they can not only perform a search and rescue, but maintain their equipment. That's the big win-win for me. And I think small projects like that encourage people in every way they can, because if you don't have any hope, you don't decide what you're going to do tomorrow. So how do we get that there? And I continue to pursue the civility in public discourse so we can talk to each other and figure out how are we going to solve these problems.
And I think the final word goes to you, Ron McMullen.
Thank you. I'm wearing a little lapel pin here that's got Iowa and the United States cross flags. So what's in this for Iowa? In the spirit of the Trump administration's business orientation, I'd like to lay down a marker for Governor Branstad. And this is it, $490 million. That's how much Iowa exported to China last year. $490 million sounds like a lot. It was out of a total Iowa export base of $12 billion. For every dollar that we export to China, with 1.4 billion people, the 35 million Canadians import $6.80 from Iowa. Canada imports way more from Iowa than China does. Mexico imports way more from Iowa than China does. Japan, 100 million Japanese, imports way more from Iowa than China does. So in 3 years, 3 years into the Branstad ambassadorship to Iowa, if we're not exporting more than $490 million worth of materials to China, then maybe it hasn't been all that good. So that's the marker. More than $490 million of Iowa exports to China. We'll see.
Something to follow up on. Thank you all.